transport shuttle drifted silently through the magnetic veil that wrapped the orbit of Orban 6, its polished hull reflecting the distorted stars. Ava Reynolds sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She was the only human aboard, and it showed. The other cadets in the shuttle, some with translucent skin, some with compound eyes, some pulsing with bioluminescent tattoos, spoke in tones too high or too low for human ears. Ava didn't mind the silence. She was used to being the outlier. The cognitive dome came into view slowly, a swirling mass of crystalline lattice suspended in orbit by gravitational stabilizers. It was not built to impress. It was built to test. Within those layered hexagonal membranes resided the most unforgiving cognitive examination known to any sentient species. The Galactic Cognitive Institute prided itself on pushing even the most advanced neural structures to the point of collapse. Ava had heard rumors of previous test takers leaving with fragments of identity lost in multidimensional echoes. She had also read that no human had ever passed the full 12D memory immersion. No human had even been invited in 70 years. As the shuttle locked into the outer airlock, the chamber filled with a soft, bioluminescent glow. One by one, the alien cadets stepped forward, each scanned by a floating orb that hovered at chest height, its interface pulsing with incomprehensible glyphs. Ava waited her turn. When she stepped forward, the orb paused. It scanned her twice, then emitted a low harmonic buzz, as if surprised, and finally displayed a single word in Standard Galactic: accepted. Inside, the cognitive dome was disorienting. The walls weren't walls at all, but shifting arrays of translucent data strands, flowing like ribbons of fog, flickering with embedded symbols and holographic overlays. Instructors floated in and out of rooms like ghosts, some with no visible body, others encased in neural exoshells. Every cadet was assigned a cube, and Ava's cube was number 19. It opened without a sound as she stepped closer. Inside was a meditation pod, a neural calibration cushion, a data plate hovering in midair, and a single chair that reconfigured itself based on her physiology. She sat down and took a deep breath. The air was laced with calming agents, but Ava's mind was already sharp. She pulled out a small leather-bound notebook from her jacket, a relic by galactic standards, and a simple black pen. As the other cadets jacked neural cables into their cranial ports, syncing with personal AIs and uploading acceleration matrices, she opened her notebook to a blank page and wrote 3 words in large letters: chunk, link, visualize. The mnemonic strategy had helped her pass dozens of exams on Earth. She had no reason to abandon it now. The announcement echoed across the dome without speakers or language. It was a direct auditory insertion. Standard protocol here, but it was Ava's first time experiencing it. The voice wasn't masculine or feminine, but precisely neutral, like a perfectly tuned instrument. Welcome to the Galactic Cognitive Institute. You are among the top 0.01% of cognitive-capable organisms in the quadrant. Your first trial begins in 3 standard rotations. Prepare your neural matrices. External aids are allowed only within individually confined limits. No information extraction devices, no memory backups, no duplication. Your consciousness is solely responsible for the retention of input. One alien cadet, a 3-eyed reptilian creature with a crest of vibrating filaments, hissed and flexed his limbs in anticipation. Another, a pale amphibian girl with silver eyes, whispered to herself in clicking syllables. Ava, meanwhile, flipped the page in her notebook and drew a quick memory palace outline, her childhood home in Colorado Springs. She mapped the entryway, the living room, the kitchen. Every drawer, shelf, or piece of furniture would become a placeholder for later data. She didn't need tech to enhance her brain. She needed anchors, imagery, and absurdity. A knock came from outside her cube. An instructor, partially phased into the wall, gestured for her to follow. Ava tucked the notebook away and rose. She walked through the corridor behind him, taking in the silent chaos around her. One cadet floated above the floor in a trance, connected to a spiraling AI loop that fed visual data at speeds that blurred the air. Another sat under a neural drip, eyes wide and unblinking, processing 900 symbols per second. Ava walked past them calmly. She knew what she was capable of. The instructor led her to the primary immersion chamber, a massive atrium at the core of the dome. Here, the test would begin. The chamber had no clear edges. Instead, it shimmered like glass submerged in liquid thought. 12 cadets were chosen to begin the test early. Ava was one of them. She could feel the subtle tension from the others as they noticed her presence. Some stared, some smirked. One whispered in a dialect not meant for human ears, but Ava recognized the body language, disbelief. As she stood in her designated zone, a smooth circle of light beneath her boots, the walls folded open. Holographic strands descended like silk threads from the ceiling, each pulsing with symbols, motion, sound, temperature, and depth. This was the test, the 12D Holographic Archive. An unfathomable maze of overlapping data, visual patterns, emotional triggers, tonal shifts, and abstract memory layers. It would run for 6 hours in accelerated neural time, equating to approximately 40 minutes in real time. Most didn't survive beyond 2. Ava's heartbeat remained steady. She recalled the words she'd written: chunk, link, visualize. The first thread reached her forehead. It shimmered with what looked like ancient galactic poetry, but hidden inside were military dates, planet codes, and social structures. She didn't fight the flood. She absorbed the pattern, broke it down, and stored it on the stairs of her grandmother's house, mentally walking the banister, linking each verse to a distinct piece of old furniture. The test had begun. Ava didn't blink. She smiled. The chamber darkened in a single pulse, and a soft chime echoed through Ava's skull. Not through her ears, but directly inside her consciousness. The first wave of the spiral archive unfolded before her like an ethereal tapestry, impossible to describe with normal sight. It wasn't just visual. It was auditory, olfactory, emotional, conceptual. 12 distinct sensory layers streamed toward her simultaneously, weaving around one another in a spiral pattern that pulsed like a living thing. Most beings would be overwhelmed by the time the third thread entered. Ava braced herself. The first wave struck. Ava felt like she had plunged into warm water and cold fire at once. A burst of color, chartreuse laced with ultramarine, spun through her inner vision. A chorus of whispers in no known language brushed her mind. A feeling, sudden and specific, bloomed in her chest. Longing, grief, joy, confused nostalgia for a life that was not her own. Embedded in this flood was a coded historical moment, something to remember. A galactic council had once collapsed under the weight of conflicting species law. The exact date, the species involved, and the planetary system rotated in glowing patterns across the top layer of the spiral. Ava's left eye twitched, involuntary, but she locked in. She had seen enough. She anchored the event to a doorway in her mental palace, her uncle's old cabin. The collapse of the council would go into the rusty mailbox at the front gate. She visualized herself sliding the memory inside like a letter, knowing that once it was placed, she could retrieve it later with near photographic clarity. She didn't need to store everything, just the hooks, the key points, the scaffolding. The archive would rebuild itself later if she placed the beams in the right order. The second spiral dropped without warning. This time the information wasn't historical, it was biological. Detailed evolutionary trees of 400 minor species, spanning 9 galaxies, exploded in a burst of 12-dimensional geometry. Most aliens around her collapsed to one knee. One, a crystalline cadet with a translucent skull, groaned as his neural lattice fractured under the flood. Ava barely noticed. She was already categorizing. She linked the first species to a blue fruit she once hated as a child. Sour, bitter, unforgettable. She gave the second species the face of her favorite high school teacher, who had a crooked smile and overused metaphors. She stacked 10 evolutionary lines into the shelves of her grandfather's basement, each filed alphabetically by species name. For the larger phylogenetic trees, she created absurd mental scenes. One family of telepathic amphibians became synchronized swimmers in pink suits, diving in and out of a lake shaped like a memory chip. Ava didn't memorize data. She translated it into absurdity. Another pulse hit, sharper now. Her temples throbbed. The third spiral was pure symbolic logic, a lexicon of shapes, tones, and gravitational fluctuations that communicated abstract laws of interspecies ethics. Some cadets gasped, others screamed. The dome's ceiling dimmed to near black as the archive adjusted difficulty in real time. Ava barely blinked. The moment she felt confusion, she leaned into humor. She imagined a courtroom filled with ducks in robes arguing over the legality of wormhole tolls. One duck threw gavel-shaped jelly beans at another. The absurd image cemented the abstract concept in her mind: rotational jurisdiction in multiversal trade. She didn't need perfection. She needed anchors. Hours passed inside the accelerated environment. Her perception of time melted, became irrelevant. Her hands occasionally clenched and unclenched, her breathing steady, but her mind worked with ruthless clarity. At one point she realized her own sweat had stopped. Her body had entered a preservation state, focusing resources entirely on cognition. The fourth spiral was a linguistic map, layered in multiple non-linear alphabets, designed to overwhelm instinct. Dozens of languages pulsed through the archive simultaneously, some tonal, others based on scent or color. Ava ignored the temptation to learn them all. Instead, she isolated repeating glyphs, attached them to names of people she knew in real life. A scent-based language that smelled like metal and berries? That was Aunt Lisa's perfume. A tonal tongue that sounded like a cello underwater? She linked it to the music she played during snowstorms. When one language mimicked the sound of paper tearing underwater, she stored it in a mental folder labeled Grandma's Attic on a Windy Day. She trusted her brain to make connections later. This was not about memorizing words. This was about creating bridges. Suddenly, a sharp alarm echoed inside the dome. It was not part of the archive. One cadet, a muscular creature with blue skin and a crown of bone spikes, collapsed completely. His neural interface fizzled and burned, smoke rising from his shoulders. Medical drones descended from the ceiling, lifting him off the platform without disrupting the test. The archive dimmed for one breath. Then it resumed. It offered no mercy. Ava's eyes burned, her lips were dry, but her posture remained unchanged. She reached the fifth spiral. An emotional archive, a dozen galactic events stored not through facts or figures, but through feelings. Despair, triumph, betrayal. Each event came as an emotional wave, paired with visual impressions and sensory cues. Ava inhaled sharply as one sequence flooded her with the grief of an entire planetary evacuation. Another forced her to relive the fear of a solar flare wiping out a communication grid mid-rescue. She staggered once, only once. She clenched her fists and pushed forward. She had prepared for this. On Earth, she had practiced with historical trauma videos, attaching each emotional signature to specific locations in her memory palace. She had trained her mind to convert feeling into language, language into image, image into recall. The evacuation became a picture of her high school gymnasium filled with umbrellas. The solar flare became her father's garage, blinking with faulty Christmas lights. She gave shape to emotion, and in doing so, mastered it. The final threat approached. No warning, no transition. It was a test of synthesis. All previous spirals converged into a single, multidimensional pattern, a moving knot of symbols, tones, species, ethics, and emotion. It hovered inches from her face, spinning like a pulsar caught in a glass orb. She didn't try to memorize it. She mapped it onto a memory structure she had built months ago, a cathedral in her mind made of mirrors and light, each corridor tied to something she already knew. The pattern slipped into place like a gear, clicking into mental architecture she had reinforced over years. Then, silence. No sound, no color, no emotion. The archive shut off in one pulse. The light in the chamber returned to neutral. The test was over. Ava exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Around her, only 3 cadets remained upright. One stared blankly ahead, another wept silently. The third had removed his neural jack and was muttering numbers in a loop. Ava stood alone in her circle, perfectly still, heart thudding. She looked down at her hands. No tremor. Her mind was full but not chaotic. Every piece of the archive had been placed, not perfectly perhaps, but precisely enough. She had survived the spiral. The silence inside the chamber was not simply the absence of sound. It was the weighted, echoing void that followed mental devastation. Some cadets remained standing, but none looked whole. The crystalline skin boy to Ava's right swayed like a candle ready to extinguish. His neural lattice blinked erratically, thin pulses skipping like static along the surface of his skin. Another student sat cross-legged in her circle, whispering names of extinct species in descending order, her eyes dilated to the edge of her sockets. Ava didn't look at either of them for long. A soft hum activated beneath her boots as the floor plates reconfigured. A pulse of indigo light traced a path from her circle to the chamber's edge. She stepped forward. Her legs felt real again, solid beneath her, but her mind remained suspended in a state of heightened clarity. Each mental anchor still glowed in her imagination. Her memory palace pulsed with life. Shelves and staircases humming with stored data, the letter in her uncle's mailbox, the pink swimmers, the ducks in robes, the jelly beans, all still there, all waiting. As she exited the chamber, an instructor floated into her path. His form was humanoid but semi-translucent, as if his skin were a curtain pulled across bioluminescent smoke. His eyes, if they could be called that, did not blink. A series of concentric rings pulsed in place of pupils. "Subject Ava Reynolds," he said, his voice smooth and neutral. "You were observed to complete the archive without the assistance of an interface." She nodded. "Correct." The instructor did not move. "You were authorized to use one. I declined." "Why?" Ava tilted her head slightly. "Because I didn't need one." The instructor processed this for a second too long. He finally moved aside. "You may return to the observation zone. Final evaluations will be conducted at dawn." She nodded once, then walked down the corridor where soft blue lighting led her toward the dormitory wing. As she passed other cadets being escorted, some limping, some in cognitive hibernation pods, she heard murmurs in alien dialects. Her name echoed once in a language of whistling consonants. Another voice said, "bass line," almost like a slur. She kept her eyes forward. Inside her cube, the chair had reformed into a recliner. On the table floated a translucent nutrition orb. Ava ignored it. Her mind still buzzed from the data flood, but she refused to rest. She pulled out her notebook and flipped through the pages, reviewing her notes from before the test. Then she turned to a blank sheet and began transcribing from memory, not full details, but mnemonics, trigger words, anchor symbols. She recreated the emotional flash patterns using colors. She sketched the evolutionary branches with exaggerated visual metaphors. By the time the orb dimmed to signal lights out, she had captured nearly 70% of the Spiral Archive's key nodes on paper. Not perfect recall? Yet. But by morning, it would be. Her sleep was short and dreamless. When the lights rose again, Ava was already seated in the testing hall. It was smaller than the archive chamber, but no less daunting. 12 cadets sat in a semicircle before a raised platform where 6 instructors, each from a different species, waited silently. In the center of the floor was a translucent cube floating chest high. Within it hovered a constantly shifting spiral of symbols. It was the synthesis construct, the very one that had marked the test's final challenge. Ava was called third. She rose and stepped into the center. The construct paused its rotation. One of the instructors, a stone-skinned creature with moss growing from his shoulders, addressed her first. "Subject Ava Reynolds," he said in an earth-deep rumble. "You were among the 4 students who reached the spiral's end. You are the only one who did not use an interface." "Yes," she replied calmly. "We will now test your recall," he continued. "You will be shown 32 sequence triggers, each linked to a sensory packet from the spiral. You must identify the category, approximate placement within the spiral, and contextual meaning. You may begin." The cube projected the first image, a shimmering pattern of violet tones, paired with a whispering hum. Ava closed her eyes for less than a second. Biological spiral, species grouping 17. Amphibious telepaths with nonverbal courtship signals. Evolutionary thread stored in mental locker marked as synchronized swimmers. There was silence. A faint chime confirmed accuracy. The second trigger followed an audio burst of tearing fabric and rushing water. Linguistic spiral. Tonal dialect known as Rin 6, categorized in mnemonic as grandmother's attic on a windy day. Chime. The third, an emotional spike of evacuation terror, with a faint scent of ozone and dust. Emotional spiral. Planetary evacuation during solar flare event. Stored in mental structure as gymnasium full of umbrellas. Chime. By the 6th response, one instructor leaned forward slightly. By the 10th, one placed her hand flat against the table. By the 14th, the crystalline instructor, previously silent, activated a private console and began replaying Ava's internal neural pattern recording. Her data remained flat. No spikes, no loops, no delays. She was not retrieving via hardware. She was retrieving from memory. By the 21st response, the room was silent except for her voice and the confirming chimes. Sequence 22 was a multivariate ethics code represented through a moving 12D shape that rotated in and out of visible geometry. Symbolic, logic, spiral, multiversal jurisdiction, debate. Mnemonic. Courtroom of ducks, throwing gavel-shaped jelly bean. Pause. Long pause. Then chime. The final challenge came not as a question, but as a reconstruction prompt. You will now rebuild the closing synthesis not from memory, the instructor said. Do not replicate the shape. Recreate the informational architecture, interrelation, balance, and progression. End of. The cube faded. A blank field of light hovered before her. Ava took a breath, visualized her mirrored cathedral, and began to walk through it aloud. She described how the data had layered itself, first biological, then emotional, then tonal, then abstract. She named the links between them, described their interdependence, and referenced her symbolic anchors. It took 26 minutes. When she finished, the construct reappeared. It matched her mental mapping at 98.7%. The moss-shouldered instructor leaned back and stared at her. You scored full marks. Ava nodded once, not smiling. The crystalline instructor broke the silence. You memorized the spiral archive using primitive mnemonic devices. I used what worked, she said. Humans are not rated as memory-optimized species. Maybe the rating is outdated. Silence again. Another instructor, this one with flowing tendrils for arms, asked, Do you consider this achievement replicable among your kind? Not without effort, Ava admitted. But yes. Mnemonics work, even without augmentation. The room remained frozen for a breath. Then the central panel flickered, recording her performance into the Institute's permanent archive. A new note was added beneath her name. Mnemonic-based cognition, full spiral retention, non-augmented, Earth origin. No one else spoke. Ava returned to her seat. She didn't look proud. She looked ready. The observation hall was not designed for applause. It wasn't meant for celebration or spectacle. Its sterile lighting, suspended seating rows, and pulsing information walls served one purpose: analysis. Yet the atmosphere shifted the moment Ava stepped off the evaluation floor. She didn't need to look at the crowd of instructors, researchers, and external observers seated behind the translucent barrier to know she had disrupted something foundational. She could feel it in the tension. Sharp, silent, electric. No one spoke, but every gaze followed her. She returned to her seat slowly, lowering herself onto the cushioned bench with practiced calm. Her heartbeat remained steady, though her mind pulsed with the soft aftershock of sustained high-level cognition. She kept her posture relaxed, but her fingers remained clasped together in her lap, grounding her. To her left, an amphibian cadet with glistening pale skin inhaled shakily and looked away. On her right, a species she didn't recognize, with obsidian neck-ridged plates instead of skin, simply tilted his head and blinked at her slowly, as though reprocessing her presence entirely. The instructor with moss-covered shoulders tapped a sequence on the console embedded in his platform. The spiral construct dissolved into light. The next cadet's name appeared, but even before the first test sequence loaded, it was clear no one would watch with the same intent. Ava had redefined the curve. She let her gaze drift toward the wide translucent panels at the rear of the hall. Beyond them floated the dark horizon of Oberon 6's orbit, wrapped in pale magnetic veils. She stared at the slow rotation of distant stars and let her thoughts settle. She didn't feel pride. She felt alert. Still immersed in the palace within her mind, she walked through the corridors in her imagination, double-checking the memory anchors, reinforcing every absurd metaphor and every symbolic mapping. She knew the real test had just begun, not in the form of questions, but in how others would respond. When the evaluations concluded 2 hours later, the cadets were dismissed back to their quarters. Ava stood as instructed, waited for the automatic doors to open, but instead of being directed toward her cube, she was intercepted. A spherical escort drone hovered before her chest and emitted a new sequence of light and sound. Not an alert, but a private summons. She followed it without hesitation. The route led her deep beneath the visible layers of the dome. This lower section was reserved for faculty-only analysis and neural research labs. She descended 3 transparent platforms and passed through 2 biometric checkpoints, each glowing with unfamiliar glyphs. The silence here was thicker, deeper, designed to absorb thought. At the far end of a corridor lined with hexagonal data tanks stood a wide, glass-walled room filled with layered holographic scrolls. The air shimmered from overclocked memory crystals. Inside the room stood 6 beings, faculty-level assessors from across the galaxy. Among them, Ava recognized only one, Dean Virus, the crystalline instructor who had first questioned her mnemonic process. His body pulsed faintly with internal light, like a slow heartbeat inside quartz. He gestured for her to enter. She stepped into the room, hands relaxed at her sides. The doors sealed behind her with a silent click. No seats, no desks, no barriers between her and the committee. The circular formation made it clear. This was not a disciplinary inquiry. It was something else. Dean Viras spoke first. His voice retained its clinical edge. You completed the spiral archive with full precision. No augmentation, no interface. Eva nodded. Correct. Would you permit a neurodissection scan to confirm there are no enhancements within your biology? Yes, she said without hesitation. I've already been scanned 3 times prior to admission. All results should be accessible in the admissions archive. Another voice joined, this one smooth and toneless, emitted from a being shaped entirely of shifting liquid metal. We've reviewed your pre-admission scans. No anomaly was detected. However, your spiral retention exceeds all known unaugmented limits. I used cognitive compression techniques, she said. Memory palaces, chunking, association, Earth methods. We know what mnemonics are, the metallic being said, but there was no disdain in the tone, only calculation. Dean Vera stepped forward slightly. Ava Reynolds, are you aware that your performance may lead to re-evaluation of over 30 galactic cognitive index baselines, including memory enhancement regulation thresholds? Yes, she replied. I expected that. A third faculty member, shaped like a floating triangular prism, slowly rotated. And you believe others from your species could replicate your methods? Not easily, she admitted, but the methods are teachable. Some require cultural understanding, others need training, most require practice and discomfort. But it's possible. The liquid metal being asked, why did you not use the neural interface when permitted? Because augmentation is not always available, and because I wanted to know where the limits really are. Dean Vera stared at her for a long moment. Then he spoke slowly, deliberately. There is a difference between a prodigy and a precedent, Ava. Which are you? She met his eyes without flinching. That depends on how many are willing to learn what I've learned. No one spoke for 10 seconds. Then, surprisingly, one of the others laughed. A low, thrumming pulse of sound that seemed to vibrate the air itself. A being shaped like a mosaic of mirrored feathers folded its limbs and nodded slightly in Ava's direction. The meeting dissolved without formal dismissal. A signal pulse vibrated across the room, nonverbal confirmation that her presence was no longer required. She turned and walked out without waiting for questions. The escort drone did not return. She navigated her own path back to the upper floors, passing scholars in polished robes, cadets in recovery chambers, and observation staff with data slates flickering in confusion. When she returned to her cube, a message flickered on the wall display. Performance review complete. Institute database updated. New human Mnemonics protocol registered under Cadet Ava Reynolds. Galactic Council inquiry pending. She didn't smile. Instead, she sat, pulled her notebook close and began to write again. Not notes this time. Lessons, structures, frameworks. She diagrammed everything she had done, how she had done it, and what could be improved. She envisioned how other humans could follow similar cognitive paths. She drew a flowchart showing when and why to deploy absurd imagery over spatial anchors. She sketched a temple, a carnival, a city, a planet, all as future memory systems. She created models for others who might try. Then she paused. She thought of a child on Earth, 10 years old, no augmentation, barely passing science. Could he learn this? Could she teach her past self this? The answer that settled inside her wasn't certainty, but it wasn't doubt either. It was resolve. The memory test had passed. But something larger had begun. In the center of the dome, deep in a private lab, Dean Verraz watched her progress through a one-way projection. His crystalline form reflected the lines she drew. He said nothing for a long time. Then, without turning to the assistant beside him, he spoke. Humans once memorized epic poems without implants, trained their minds in silence, survived extinction by remembering what others forgot. Perhaps we've underestimated the primitive. And for the first time in recorded cycles, the Institute logged a new tag into its internal index of species. Homo sapiens mnemonic capable. The dome no longer regarded her as a visitor. That was the first shift Ava noticed when she stepped into the communal atrium the following cycle. The way the walls responded, dimmed slightly to her presence, adjusted their light spectrum to match her retinal comfort profile, and even softened the sound of her footsteps across the polymer floor. Subtle changes, but deliberate. The system had absorbed her name into its neural registry, not just as a cadet, but as a marker. The other students, or what remained of them, reacted differently now. Some kept their distance. Others stared without attempting to hide it. One cadet, a boy with copper skin and a crown of bioluminescent spines, approached her with a mixture of caution and fascination. He didn't speak, only extended a data crystal toward her. When she took it, he bowed his head slightly and walked away. Ava turned the crystal over in her fingers, plugged it into the console by her seat, and read the message that unfolded in clean, formal text. Share your method, we are ready to learn. Her hand tightened around the edge of the console for a moment. It had begun. Within hours, the Institute officially requested she host an open workshop. Ava had no official title, no academic position, and no rank among faculty. Yet her performance had created a tremor through every level of the educational hierarchy. She stood at the front of an amphitheater designed for alien thought forms, recalibrated now for spoken instruction. There were no scripts, no assistants, no AI prompts, only her voice, her notebook, and her memory palace, etched in words and metaphor. She began by explaining the concept of association, not in terms of neural algorithms or thought scaffolds, but in human images. She spoke of the hippocampus like a corridor lined with memories, where smell and rhythm could override precision. She taught how humor could lock symbols in place more effectively than repetition. She gave examples from her test, without disclosing classified details, replacing real content with shapes, tastes, and exaggerated colors. She watched as students scribbled, blinked rapidly, or fell into deep meditative focus. One reptilian student whispered her words to himself repeatedly, crafting internal connections. Another created clay shapes in response, linking concepts to physical rhythm. Ava didn't stop. She walked through the foundations of Earth's oldest memory techniques: loci, chunking, chaining, encoding. She showed them how to turn intangible floods of data into architecture, into cities of thought. Instructors began to attend, at first quietly, sitting among students in lower tiers, but eventually requesting private sessions. Some were skeptical. One asked whether her brain structure had unusual adaptations. She offered a scan. Again, it came back normal. Another claimed her success was a statistical anomaly. She countered by presenting a cadet, an amphibian girl, who had already replicated the first tier of her mnemonic structure after only 3 days of practice. The instructors fell silent. What began as a lecture evolved into a movement. Students created their own memory palaces, shared anchors, and borrowed metaphors across species. A group of insectoid cadets built mnemonic labyrinths based on their hive patterns. A crystalline cadet visualized memory through harmonic frequencies, linking each tone to emotional pulses. Ava watched it all grow, not as a leader, but as a spark. But as always, such disruption created friction. 2 cycles later, she received a summons from the Galactic Council's representative on Oberon 6. The summons was not optional. The chamber she entered was unlike any within the dome, its geometry untranslatable, folded in on itself in recursive curves that bent the air. The council's representative, a being who spoke through a prism of harmonic light, did not greet her with words, only a sudden rush of multisensory input that stabilized into language. Human Ava Reynolds, your performance has shifted predictive models. Entire branches of cognitive research are under internal review. Do you understand the magnitude? Yes, she answered, standing without hesitation in the center of the chamber. Your methods are spreading. And not only among students. Do you intend to disrupt the augmentation industry? No, she said clearly, but I intend to remind you that intelligence is not always engineered. Sometimes it's trained. The chamber vibrated, a pulse of ambient emotion. Neither approval nor disapproval passed through her chest like a slow breeze. We have long measured capacity by interface efficiency. Your methods introduce variables we did not account for. Ava tilted her head. Maybe that's the point. The council was silent again. Then the voice returned. You will not be prevented, but you will be watched. I assumed that already, she replied. When she left the chamber, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't even nervous. She felt clarity, direction. Her role was no longer about passing a test. She was now a deviation point, something in the curve that had bent reality slightly out of alignment, and that alignment would never return to where it was. Weeks passed. Ava remained at the Dome as a visiting fellow, not because she applied, but because the Institute created the title around her presence. She designed training regimens for incoming cadets, regardless of species. She submitted revised evaluation standards. She even worked with neural importer developers to build translation layers for mnemonic-style thought paths. Her methods were encoded into holographic tutorials, not as replacements for augmentation, but as tools that expanded what augmentation couldn't touch, the flexible, flawed, but deeply associative human memory. On her final day at the Dome, she stood on the external platform near the observation ring, watching Overend 6 rotate below her in tranquil silence. Behind her, the Dome's systems flickered with activity. In front of her, the stars pulsed gently, like old friends watching her from a distance. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt purposeful. Her shuttle arrived quietly, locking onto the magnetic rail. She stepped inside and took her seat. As the vessel detached and began its journey back toward Terran space, Ava opened her notebook one last time and wrote 6 words across the page. The mind remembers what it honors. Below it, she drew a simple sketch. A key, a door, a room full of impossible light. She closed the notebook and leaned back. She was no longer just a student. She was a prototype of something older than machines, something that had waited in silence for centuries. And now it had returned, not as a relic, but as a force,